Most Canadians assume that our country has laws protecting animals on farms. But do we?
What kind of laws do you think we currently have for animals on farms right now?
There's certain space.
Sanitation, space, and quality of life.
What I would hope is that animals don't experience pain.
Do you think that it's important that Canada has strong laws that protect animals on farms?
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Of course, yeah, definitely.
Behind closed doors, there's a staggering legal void. Canada has no laws that regulate how animals are treated on farms. So why does the industry say they play by the rules if there are none? Polling consistently shows that Canadians overwhelmingly support stronger protections for farmed animals. 94% believe animals' physical and psychological needs should be met. 68% say animal welfare should take priority over low meat prices. When given the chance, people act on these values. Hundreds of thousands have signed petitions pushing for stronger animal welfare protections. This isn't a fringe issue. Animal protection is a mainstream Canadian value. So if Canadians care this much, why aren't there laws protecting animals on farms? Animal agriculture in Canada operates on a massive scale. In 2024 alone, 853 million land animals were slaughtered for food. Millions more die before they even reach slaughter, on farms, in hatcheries, or during transport. Throughout their lives, farmed animals endure extreme confinement, painful procedures without pain relief, and chronic health problems caused by breeding for maximum production. This is not a system built for animal welfare. It's a system designed for efficiency and profit. And here's the core problem. There are no laws in Canada that set enforceable standards for how animals must be treated on farms.
I am very surprised. I had no idea. I really thought there was some minimum requirements.
Unlike other areas of law where governments set clear rules, animal welfare on farms is largely left unregulated in Canada. You might be thinking, but what about animal cruelty laws? Canada's criminal code does prohibit certain forms of animal cruelty, but it has very limited application to farming. It's technically illegal to cause unnecessary pain, suffering, or injury to an animal. But what does unnecessary mean? Well, courts and enforcement authorities have consistently accepted that animal suffering is considered necessary if it's associated with routine farming practices as part of food production, no matter how significant that pain and suffering may be for an animal. And even in cases of clear abuse that fall outside the scope of what is considered necessary, authorities are often reluctant to pursue criminal charges. There are federal regulations that apply during transport and slaughter, but they're also inadequate and don't account for the vast majority of the animals' lives. The provinces do have their own animal protection laws, but they too have a major gap. Across Canada, these laws generally prohibit causing distress to animals. But each province also has a broad exemption for generally accepted agricultural practices. If a harmful practice, even one that causes fear, pain, or chronic deprivation, is common within an industry, it's often treated as generally acceptable. So even practices that cause significant suffering are permitted. This creates a system where the industry itself effectively defines what counts as acceptable treatment. Meanwhile, other countries have taken a very different approach. Countries like the United Kingdom, Sweden, Switzerland, and New Zealand have enacted clear, enforceable laws protecting farmed animals. Many have banned practices that are still legal and common within Canada, like gestation crates for pigs and cages for hens. Canada simply hasn't kept up. In fact, Canada received a D grade on the Global Animal Protection Index produced by World Animal Protection, which assesses the animal welfare legislation and policy commitments of 50 countries worldwide. So with no real animal protection laws in place, who decides how animals are treated on farms?
It's hard to imagine managing farm animal welfare without NFACC.
Our industries have many guidelines for animal health and care.
I don't know even those who are in that particular rural riding understand what NFACC does.
Decisions about what can and cannot be done to animals on farms have largely been handed over to the industry itself through an organization called the National Farm Animal Care Council, or NFACC. NFACC presents itself as a neutral, independent authority. It claims to oversee farmed animal welfare, setting standards for care and handling through species-specific codes of practice. But that's an illusion. NFACC has no lawmaking power, no enforcement power, and very limited public accountability. It produces only voluntary guidelines, not legal requirements. NFACC's origins were fairly promising. In the 1980s, Canada began developing voluntary codes of practice for farmed animals. These early efforts were motivated by growing public concern about farmed animal welfare and inspired by similar initiatives in the United Kingdom to try and address some of the more controversial farming practices, such as intensive confinement. The federal government funded and published these codes, managed through the Canadian Federation of Humane Societies, now known as Humane Canada. But over time, responsibility shifted away from government coordination, and in 2005, NFACC was formally established as a private and, importantly, industry-led organization responsible for overseeing code development. The codes, once linked to public policy, became voluntary instruments governed primarily by industry interests. Today, NFACC functions as the de facto national standard setter for on-farm animal welfare in Canada. It presents itself as bringing together animal welfare groups, government, farmers, and industry. But its governance structure is overwhelmingly industry-driven. At the time of recording, out of its 54 members, only 2 represent animal welfare organizations. There are a few government and science representatives, but 87% are industry-aligned, commodity groups, processors, retailers, and others with financial interests. In practice, this means the industries most affected by welfare standards are the ones writing them. Animal welfare advocates are often outnumbered, pressured, or forced to compromise just to secure minimal improvements. What NFACC calls collaboration is really industry control disguised as consensus. NFACC's codes of practice cover nearly all commonly farmed animals in Canada. But what exactly are these codes of practice? And more importantly, what do they actually do? NFACC's codes of practice are supposed to guide how animals are housed, fed, handled, killed on farms. They sound authoritative, talking about, requirements and standards. And that language matters because it gives the impression that there are these clear, enforceable rules governing how animals are treated on farms. But in reality, they reflect what industry is already willing to do, not what science, experts, or the public expect. And this is where the system becomes misleading. Because while these codes aren't legally binding, they're often treated as if they are. They're referenced by industry, they're cited in public communications, and they're even used by governments and enforcement bodies as a kind of benchmark for what's considered acceptable. And that creates a powerful illusion that animal welfare in Canada is regulated, monitored, and enforced, when in reality, it's largely being defined internally by the industry itself. And the codes process itself reinforces this. Each code is developed through a multi-step process. There's a code development committee and a separate scientific committee. On a 15 to 18 person code committee, industry representatives hold the majority, while animal welfare groups are often limited to just 1 seat. Scientific committees are tasked with reviewing evidence and informing the codes, but they can include individuals with direct or indirect financial ties to the industries under review, raising real questions about independence and conflicts of interest. Together, they select a small number of topics for review in each code update, often leaving out many important welfare issues. The scientific committee reviews research and produces a report on selected welfare issues, things like housing, space allowance, or painful procedures. But the scientific committee doesn't write the codes or decide what gets adopted. Their research is sent back to the industry-dominated code development committees to make the final decisions. and they will always prioritize economic feasibility. So science can inform the process, but it doesn't drive it. So while NFACC describes its process as consensus-based, the reality is that industry is calling the shots. At their core, the codes don't set out to define what's best for animals. They define what is acceptable within current production systems. And that distinction matters, because it means the codes are not designed to challenge the structure of industrial farming. They're designed to accommodate it. Take egg-laying hens. Over 75% of Canadians oppose caging hens, but in Canada, under NFACC's codes of practice, millions of hens spend their entire lives in cages. Under NFACC's codes of practice, conventional cages can remain in use until 2036, and there's no requirement of a full transition to cage-free systems. Even enriched cages, despite their name, offer only slightly more space than conventional battery cages. Hens are still unable to run, jump, flap their wings, dust bathe, or nest, leading to things like weak bones, chronic pain, and psychological stress. Chickens raised for meat, often called broiler chickens, suffer greatly due to genetic selection and breeding for unnaturally rapid growth. They often struggle to walk or support their own bodies, leading to lameness, heart failure, and chronic pain. The codes allow for birds to be bred to suffer. They also permit environments that are largely barren, with little stimulation, limited space, and minimal periods of darkness for rest. Contrast this with global programs like the Better Chicken Commitment and Global Animal Partnership, which require practices like slower growing breeds, 8 hours of continuous light, and 6 hours of uninterrupted darkness. For pigs, the codes allow a range of practices that are widely recognized as harmful to animal welfare. For example, piglets can be killed by blunt force trauma, a method known as thumping, that involves slamming them against a hard surface. Procedures like castration and tail docking are also still permitted, often without adequate pain control, even though science shows these procedures are intensely painful. Gestation crates are restrictive metal cages that are widely known to cause both physical and psychological suffering for pigs. But in Canada, the NFACC codes allow mother pigs to be confined in gestation crates for up to 35 days at a time. But the industry has unilaterally decided to ignore this guideline until 2029 anyway, meaning mother pigs in Canada can still live nearly their entire lives in cages so small they can't even turn around. Within the dairy industry, the code allows cows to be kept in tie stall systems, where they're tethered in place for most or even all of their lives when not being milked. This level of confinement isn't just restrictive, it has real physical and psychological consequences. This cycle begins shortly after birth, when calves are separated from their mothers. This practice causes distress for both cow and calf, and is standard across the industry. For many calves, this leads to individual housing, where they're kept alone in small enclosures during the earliest stages of life, limiting movement and their social development. But other jurisdictions have begun to move away from these practices, implementing systems that require cows to have the ability to move freely. In Canada, however, the codes continue to permit and even outline steps for how these practices should take place, allowing confinement, early separation, and intensive production to remain standard across the industry. Across all sectors, the codes allow physical alterations to animals in order to manage the conditions that they are kept in. These include practices such as what is referred to as beak trimming of chickens, which is the cutting off of part or all of a chicken's beak, tail docking of piglets, which involves cutting off part of their tail, and the dehorning of cows, which involves removing or preventing the growth of horns, typically by cutting, burning, or using chemicals. These procedures are performed to reduce the harms caused by overcrowding and confinement, not because they benefit the animals themselves. While the codes acknowledge that these procedures are painful, they do not consistently require effective pain relief, particularly for young animals. The codes also permit the routine killing of animals considered unviable to the industry. In the egg industry, male chicks can't lay eggs, so they're killed shortly after hatching, often through high-speed maceration. On pig farms, smaller or weaker piglets may be killed using blunt force trauma. These practices are not exceptional. They're built into standard production systems and they're permitted under the codes. Across every sector, the pattern is the same. The codes allow for intensive confinement, painful procedures, and intensive production practices that many Canadians would consider unacceptable. But the issue goes beyond just what's written into the codes. It's how the entire system operates. There is no consistent enforcement tied to these standards. There is no independent inspections. And there are no real penalties for non-compliance. And no transparent public reporting. All while the system continues to present itself as evidence that animal welfare is being addressed. So while the codes are often presented as a solution, they are, in reality, a major part of the problem. And investigations have repeatedly shown this. Across farms, transport, and slaughter facilities, undercover investigations and whistleblower accounts have exposed routine violations of even the minimal guidelines in the codes, such as animals with untreated injuries, overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, and clear abuse. These findings point to a basic reality. The codes set a low bar, and without enforcement, even that bar is not reliably met. They create the appearance of oversight without delivering meaningful protection. This approach to farmed animal welfare sets Canada apart, and not in a good way. Most comparable peer countries have moved toward enforceable, government-led animal welfare laws that set clear minimum standards. Canada has taken a different path by relying on a voluntary, industry-led system to define what is acceptable. And grocery retailers and restaurants who previously committed to higher welfare sourcing are now deferring to the standards laid out by NFACC. As other countries strengthen protections and phase out harmful practices, Canada continues to allow them. The result is a growing gap between public expectations, international standards, and the reality on Canadian farms. If this system was working, we would expect to see clear standards, consistent enforcement, and measurable animal welfare progress. But we don't. Instead, what we see is a system that maintains the status quo while creating the appearance of oversight. So the question becomes, if this system isn't working, what would real animal welfare reform actually look like?
I'm surprised that there's no laws.
We need proper laws.
It starts with law and recognizing that meaningful change requires more than small adjustments. It requires clear laws, independent oversight, and real accountability. Canada needs comprehensive federal legislation that sets enforceable minimum standards for how animals are treated on farms. Not voluntary guidelines, but actual laws. Laws that recognize animals as sentient beings, prohibit clearly harmful practices, and that can evolve over time as science and public expectations change. It requires an independent, transparent process for setting those standards, one that serves the public interest, not industry priorities. It requires independent oversight, separating animal welfare from agricultural promotion to eliminate the conflicts of interest and ensure that protecting animals is treated as a public responsibility and not a secondary concern. And it requires real enforcement. Laws and standards only matter if they're enforced. Canada needs a system of independent inspections, meaningful penalties, and transparent reporting. These reforms are not radical ideas. They reflect what already exists in many other countries and what Canadians already expect. What's missing in Canada isn't the roadmap, it's the decision to follow it.
Cruelty for profit.
Canada can continue to rely on a system that creates the appearance of farmed animal welfare, or it can build one that actually delivers it. Join us in calling for an end to industry self-regulation via NFACC and the beginning of real farmed animal welfare laws in Canada.